Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CFO Leadership Forum. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we'll turn the floor over to our esteemed opening keynote speaker. First, we would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsors, Avid Exchange, GP, Workday, Divvy, Lease Accelerator, and Vertex. Our sponsors are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. We also welcome you to stay socially connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please use the hashtag ArgyleDigital and follow us on Twitter at argyleexecforum.com. Also, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn for special announcements. I would like to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we have curated based on the feedback we have received over the years from our members. We have worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, we want to hear from you. So during each session, we encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screen. Following each presentation, we have set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on your questions. Thank you again for joining us today. Now, let's get started. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Sumita Saini, Senior Vice President, Enterprise FP&A Commercial Finance. We're very excited to have Sumita for our opening keynote presentation titled Scenario Planning for Long-Term Stability. Welcome, Sumita. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everyone. So excited to be here and sharing information on this very important topic. For many of us who might be in finance on this call, as you know, our lives have been upended a bit the past few years with the pandemic. So I think we've all been practicing some form of scenario planning, but I'm excited to share with you some more details regarding this. So as we move on to my first slide on scenario planning, just a fun factoid on this. So Nick, if you just move on to the next one, please. Yeah, so a fun fact on scenario planning. Scenario planning actually was pioneered by the US military. Actually, if you can go back, yeah, this one, perfect. Thank you, Nick. Was pioneered by the US military, and they do this constantly where they run their exercises looking out up to 20 years to guide their research and development efforts. So that's just a fun fact, and that's really made its way into our daily lives in finance. And scenario planning has really always been a key tenet of the CFO office. And with today's financial leaders, we have the challenge of navigating the current economic headwinds that we're all too familiar with, but also positioning our organizations to respond flexibly to future trends. So CFOs always, and the finance teams, always need to make sure that our organizations have the wherewithal to be able to react to whatever might come. For some, it might mean that we're focused more intently on liquidity. Cash is king, and the last few years it's been even more highlighted. And specifically, financial leaders managing tight margin businesses. That really means you are able to ramp operations up or down in response to economic conditions. So by visualizing all these potential opportunities and risks, essentially businesses become more proactive versus reactive. So that's something that we've always asked of our finance teams. And scenario planning really allows you to do that. And it's really a way to assert control over all the uncertainties in some shape or form by really identifying those assumptions. By building the awareness of what could happen, you can, really spot warning signs that might be out there, act accordingly. And when the worst case event happens, the scenario planning documents add a lot of value to playing out all these multiple outcomes and list all these immediate steps that need to happen to contain that damage. But they're also valuable for best case scenarios and options. Say, what if you have an amazing product that goes viral and the demand spikes up 300%? Wouldn't we all love that? But are you ready for that? Are you ready to fulfill that demand? Say you have a really opportunistic acquisition that comes your way. Are you able to quickly run through the hoops and take that opportunity? Are you prepared? So scenario planning is really all about being prepared. And ultimately, it's storytelling. We in finance know that it's about the storytelling. And scenario planning basically tells a story with many endings. So crafting that story, crafting that narrative requires really for us to understand what are the assumptions going into the storytelling, what are the potential business realities that we live in, so that we can clearly outline what are the ensuing outcomes. So with that, let's move onto the next slide that talks about the why, right? As I kind of briefly alluded to, the great is so much greater than has ever been before. The pandemic unfolded a blur of employee safety, economic shocks, and made it even more critical for us to understand and forecast the what ifs. So think about scenario planning as really outlining the what ifs in our world. And the business as usual budgeting and planning processes that we've all been accustomed to with its traditional inputs and standard approaches doesn't work. So we have to be a little bit more nimble to try and understand how do we streamline this process. But 43% of the CFOs surveyed by McKinsey said that they really have this need in today's world. And basically, successful scenario planning means that finance must look forward and backward in order to allow the businesses to respond quickly when needed. We know that inflation continues. There's been continued tightness in the supplies market. It has abated a bit in the recent few months, but there is continued instability in the global markets, such as in Europe, and it's factors that could potentially lead to a greater inflation coming our way, or any other economic upheavals. We're already talking about a potential recession. So all of these factors really mean that we in finance and the CFOs really need to remain very vigilant regarding inflation and all these other factors, so that we're ready to react to these environmental conditions. And it's also important for us in finance and CFOs to avoid the inflation tunnel vision, right? So time traveling, because we have the advantage to be able to think about what is going on 6 months from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years into the future. And so the farther out that you go, you're going to have lots of scenarios. But as those horizons get closer, it really comes down to the number of things that are going to affect me in 2 years from now is much larger than much larger than what's going to affect my next 6 months. So the next 6 months are critical, but if you don't plan for the future, next 2 years, the uncertainty can really come back and hurt you. One important caveat as we think about scenario planning, it is a little different from business continuity planning. So the scenario planning plays a longer game, as I mentioned, and considers revenue over time, because without revenues and cash in, nothing else matters. Business continuity, however, is about how the business will react to, say, a disaster. So succession planning, disaster recovery, those are all part of business continuity planning. So I just wanted to kind of mention that as we go into the what, the why, and the how to implement a successful scenario planning strategy at your company. It's really talking about an integrated approach to dealing with uncertainty. So then moving along to the next slide, let's talk about, just a quick visual of the scenario planning. And this is exactly it, right? You have many outcomes. You need to have clear assumptions coming in, and then you have a range of scenarios that you can kind of look at and put a time horizon of where you want to be and how you want to how do you want to get there, depending on the external factors that could impact your business. So really, you have to be ready to pivot on a dime. And successful scenario planning, again, means that CFOs and finance organizations must look both forward and backward in order to ensure that we're responding in as quickly as we can when needed. So I almost like to think of us as time travelers. So us in finance and CFOs in particular are really time travelers. You're looking forward and backward at the same time to ensure that the business stays successful. So then our next slide will go into the what, the why, and the how. So what is scenario planning? Hopefully the earlier slides gave us some context into the what. So again, just, to outline this, we're really enabling the decision makers to identify the ranges of the potential outcomes and really what is the financial impact of those. You're estimating the financial impact, both the good and the bad. So, as we think about scenario planning, it's a very disciplined way to formulate your strategic hypothesis in the context of existing driving forces and all the uncertainties that it brings. It really allows you, the organization, to be better prepared and increases the business resiliency so that we can adapt to the ever-changing environment. It's very critical that all functions are included in this. You need finance, you need operations, HR is a very critical function, IT in developing the framework with the uncertainty of the emerging world. So moving along then to our next slide, let's talk about the why. Very obvious, we talked about the business resiliency, and it's a competitive advantage. So if you have a business that has scenario planning outlined with your clearly outlined assumptions, you have your framework so that it can allow the board to make any non-emergency decisions, you're already at a place where you have a competitive advantage over a business that does not, because you have a roadmap of how to continue successfully if you have different forks in your road and you know what those potential ensuing outcomes might be. I think it's important to know that from a cultural perspective, it really pushes us in finance and the rest of the organization to think constructively, avoid the groupthink, because when you think about the what ifs, you might come up with a different what if scenario than somebody else. So it really allows that creative component of why we are here in finance, trying to think about, how do you provide the guardrails to the business to move forward successfully, and it within the realm of the current reality, but even what the what ifs of things that are unknown that could come our way. So comprehensive, scenario planning obviously takes a lot of time, effort, and money. There are some advantages and disadvantages that we should definitely consider. One, let's talk about the advantages very quickly. We alluded to a few of those. We can be better prepared. We can move faster. We have the stakeholders, and if the board or in the executives are not available during an actual extreme event, the company also has a documentation and well-prepared plans to fall back on. What are some of the disadvantages? It's an enormous undertaking. It can be a lengthy process. We are all stretched for time with your monthly forecasting, your annual budgeting process, your long-term strategic planning. So the scenario planning definitely is a heavy lift. And for large enterprises, plans can take months to create. So that's a disadvantage. The other big disadvantage of scenario planning is just the very word in itself. The plans can change, the external factors can change very quickly on us. And they could be certain what-if scenarios that we have not considered, or they could be of larger magnitude or of smaller scale. And these can happen very quickly, which means that the scenario planning tool must be a living process with constant updates and conditions and assumptions evolve. So those are some of the important things to think about as you consider scenario planning. So moving along to the how, the macroeconomic expectations have to be used in conjunction with scenario planning. Those are your inputs, so that as you build out your framework of the near-term expectations and you level set, what are your expectations for all the different departments. So there are a few things that you have to take into consideration when you start to implement a scenario planning. First, what is the issue we're trying to assess? How far out into the horizon do you want to go? Do you want to go 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? So you determine that. What are the major external factors that are likely to impact our scenarios? I think that is important for us to know, and those are fairly similar across most businesses, but where different business, a manufacturing business would have a slightly different set of factors than, say, a retailer. Then you always have to address what your key internal drivers are, and then what are the risks to all these scenarios? Do you have the right data, the technology, the resources, and the skills that you need to develop and maintain these scenarios? You need a commitment from your senior management. You need to select team members. You need to organize all of this. So we'll go into some of the framework options that I'm going to provide and kind of walk you through those. So as we move on to the next slide, let's talk about the roadmap. You want to simplify your long-term, your scenario planning, 3-step process. You identify, you develop, and then you build. You identify all the critical triggers we kind of talked about. It's one of the second point is critical. You want to make sure that you are aligned with your company goals. And then, of course, you always have to combine your historical data with the plausible outcomes. Prioritization is another key factor. It's so easy as you identify your critical triggers. You could come up with a list of 10, but you have to prioritize in crisis scenarios. It's difficult to do everything all at once. Then you start to develop those multiple scenarios. As you develop those multiple scenarios, so important to listen, evaluate, and share back with the teams and your senior management. Focus on the drivers, keep it simple. And as I mentioned, when you prioritize, 2 or 3 major uncertainties are what that you want to always focus on. And as you start to build them, standardization and automation will be your best friend because these move quickly in order to respond nimbly. Try and implement a timeline, and then your decisions should be monitored real time so that you are bringing it all together and reporting back. And of course, the tenets of this are people, process, and systems. Moving along to our next slide, just going to give a time check. This is an iterative process. So you have your 3-step process, and then as you think about scenario planning, as I mentioned earlier, it needs to be a continuous iteration as your circumstances change and new information comes your way. So we kind of talked about all of this. I won't dive into this. This will be available for you to review later. But as you think about the 3 blocks and then about the iterative process, you want to consider this 5-step process here. And then moving along to our next slide, I've also provided you a scenario planning matrix. You have a tool here that allows you to outline your scenarios to the far right. And then as you kind of think about what is the key issue you're addressing, what's the time horizon, what are the major external factors that are likely to impact your scenarios. You have your internal factors, your internal drivers that you need to address. You need to recognize the importance of the team's time that is going to go into developing all of this. Defining your assumptions is so critical. You need to be able to clearly establish the relationships amongst those drivers and limit the number of scenarios as we mentioned. And then as you develop your perspective, decide on how you will put your scenarios to use that will inform the scope and has to always feed into your company's vision and strategy. And then how will you assess success? How will you assess that all the steps and your scenario planning document was successful? So all of those things need to be put in perspective and documented. And then the maintenance, as we talked about, do you have the right data? Do you have the right technology? Do you have the right talent, the resources to embark on this monumentous journey? Moving along to the next slide here, best practices. Assemble the right team. Usually scenario planning is led by finance, typically the FP&A function. But as we talked about earlier, this is an integrated approach. So we want to make sure that we are not doing this alone. It needs leaders across the business units and HR to get their input. We need to get the right data so that we're executing this with confidence. So not just the general ledger data, but historical comparative sales data. You need your headcount, your expected growth. You need a lot of this other information. So you're bringing it all together so that you have the right foundation that's built here. And then as you start to model with the basic scenarios, you've developed your low, medium, and high models. The low is obviously where your costs and revenues are challenging. Your medium is where your sales continue to grow at your current pace. And then high usually, is built on your increasing demand and acceleration in sales due to big changes in the market. The goal is to ramp up capacity without incurring costs that would eat into your margin. So you want to kind of think about those as you develop your 3 basic scenarios with the low, medium, and high models. And then you always want your break-even analysis so that you're supporting this with data so that you have your decision-making regarding your cash flows at your break-even levels. And then just summarizing this very quickly, bringing it all together, we are, so if you want to move on to the next slide, Nick, this is our last slide. We talked about, in finance and the CFO's office in particular, we are one of the few people in the company whose scope and remit crosses the whole company. We have information and data across the board. So it's really critical as we bring it all together. We have the communication with all of the stakeholders to understand what is needed. And we're using our unique ability to see across the company to bring it all together, determining the building blocks. And as we listen, we evaluate, and we share back with the teams and especially senior leaders, you'll eliminate that process transformation inertia that can creep into this process because it is a heavy lift. And I just kind of listed out a few areas as you evaluate your team and processes. It touches across all of these areas with cash, capital spend, working capital, as well as your monthly management reporting as you fold in scenario planning into your workflows. I think it's so important, as I mentioned earlier, you focus on your business drivers. Data standardization will be your biggest friend. And always remember that prioritization is going to be so critical in this process because of the ambiguity of what we're dealing with. And lastly, stay flexible, be flexible. With that, I think we have a few minutes to take questions. So I'm going to take a quick peek at the questions that have come our way and look to see if there are some that I can answer for you. What role does AI or automation play in scenario planning? I think that's a really, really good question because, as we know, AI has crept in a lot into our forecasting world over the last, I would say, a year. And so the more that we are able to leverage the data and AI into the automation, I think it makes our jobs easier from the number crunching perspective. And then we're more focused on the narrative and the storytelling that I alluded to very earlier. Let's see. The next question, can you make any recommendations for organizations struggling to strengthen their FP&A function? Yes. I think the biggest challenge for FP&A has been communication. I would say that the biggest challenge to building an effective FP&A team is bringing on board the right talent that has the skills to communicate effectively with business leaders and make friends with people across the organization. I cannot tell you how important that is. Too often, we in FP&A are considered, we're in everybody's business. So, I'm sure I see a lot of heads nodding here when, FP&A is there to ask questions. But the more that we can gain the trust of the teams, of the business units, the easier our job becomes. And how do you do that? You have to show them what value you bring to the table. And you have to show them the benefits of how numbers can translate into effective business decision making and how it makes the business leaders look good. And I think too often we in finance are known to say the word no. I think if we can change the way we in FP&A spell that word no, if we make that KNOW, really know the business, I think that is a very effective way of breaking down those barriers of communication and becoming that trusted business advisor. So with that, I will turn it back to Nick to see if there's any other questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sumita, for such an insightful presentation. As a reminder, audience members can still enter questions to be answered later. And I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Have a great day, everyone.